Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Silva Braga. Good to be with you. A federal judge ordered former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort to jail Friday morning. Manafort is awaiting trial on a variety of financial charges, but the judge revoked Manafort's bail after prosecutors accused him of tampering with the witnesses of that trial. Paula Reed has more on that.
Former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort arrived at federal court in Washington today to try to convince a judge not to lock him up. But the judge revoked his bail after federal prosecutors accused him of calling and texting witnesses ahead of his upcoming trial. Manafort and his Russian business partner, Konstantin Kilimnik, allegedly asked European contacts to testify that their lobbying work did not take place in the U.S. Judge Amy Berman Jackson told Manafort's attorney, "This is not middle school. I can't take his cell phone. I have no appetite for this." Manafort will now remain in jail until his trial concludes later this year. He currently faces dozens of charges, including financial fraud, money laundering, and false statements.
Mr. President, have you spoken with Paul Manafort, Mr. President?
Speaking with reporters earlier in the day, the president defended his former campaign chairman.
They went back 12 years to get things that he did 12 years ago?
Manafort served as campaign chairman for 5 months, including during the Republican convention. But Mr. Trump today downplayed Manafort's role in the campaign.
You know, Paul Manafort worked for me for a very short period of time. He worked for me, what, for 49 days or something? A very short period of time.
After Manafort was sent to jail, the president tweeted, "Wow, what a tough sentence for Paul Manafort. What about Comey and Crooked Hillary and all the others? Very unfair."
And Paula Reed joins us now from Washington. Okay, Paula, so Paul Manafort in prison as his trial plays out. What impact, if any, does this have on the special counsel in their case?
Well, the special counsel is really throwing everything it can at Paul Manafort. Let's look at what they've done so far. They have filed dozens of charges against him. They have flipped his co-defendant, and now they have convinced a judge to put him in jail. Now, I've previously been told by sources familiar with Manafort's thinking that all along he's been willing to fight these charges, knowing he would likely be convicted because he expected a presidential pardon would keep him out of spending the rest of his life in jail. Today, the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, also told me that there could be some presidential pardons at the end of the Mueller probe. He told me that he's advised the president not to pardon anyone before the Mueller probe wraps up, but he's clearly sending a signal to Paul Manafort while he sits in that jail cell somewhere in this general Washington area, and he's thinking about whether or not he wants to cooperate to get himself out. He's sending a signal that a presidential pardon is still very much a possibility for him.
That pardon notwithstanding, Manafort's associate Rick Gates pleaded guilty to conspiracy and making false statements back in February. How does his cooperation affect Manafort's situation?
Well, it's never good when your co-defendant, someone that you're facing charges with about work that you engaged in together, it's never good when they flip because they know where all the evidence is to potentially convict you on those charges. So that definitely increases the pressure on Manafort, but he is in a truly unique situation because there is a chance that even if he was convicted on every single charge, he could be exonerated. He could be pardoned and never have to spend a day in jail. So in any other case, if your co-defendant flips, you're pretty much cooked and likely to spend the rest of your life in jail. But for Manafort, that's not necessarily true. Now, Mr. Gates decided to cooperate. He originally was in lockstep with Manafort. They were going to fight this all the way. But after realizing how much it was going to cost him, both emotionally and financially, to fight these charges, he was not willing to wait for a pardon. So he decided to cooperate. So far, though, Manafort is not following suit.
Well, it's an unusual case in so many ways. One of them, that the president is involved. What do we know about him agreeing or not agreeing to an interview with Mueller and what that would look like?
Well, I spoke with the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, today, and he told me that they will make a decision by July 4th. Now, at one point, Giuliani told us, well, he can't make a decision until North Korea, and there was another obstacle, but now they've said that they will make a decision by July 4th, whether or not the president will cooperate and sit down and answer questions from special counsel, or whether they will fight that. And that could be extraordinary. If the president was to be subpoenaed, that would go to the Supreme Court. It would be very complicated. Giuliani told me today he's less likely to encourage the president to sit down for that interview because of the Office of Inspector General report that came out yesterday. He says that that report really raised questions for him and the president about whether or not he would be treated fairly. Now, I pushed back on this. I said, wait a second. That sounds like pretext. I think you're looking for an excuse to get out of this interview. But Giuliani said no. He believes that some of the text messages that were revealed by the Inspector General that show political bias on the part of some of these investigators, that's enough for him to believe that his client may not be treated fairly. And he says at this point it's unlikely the president will talk to Robert Mueller's investigators.
And we've been looking at a graphic with some of that evidence, those text messages that were released yesterday. Paula Reed, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And for more on this, we're joined by Ryan Goodman. He's a former special counsel at the Department of Defense and a professor at New York University School of Law. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Okay, so you wrote this piece back on Friday in Just Security, arguing that we already know enough to believe that Paul Manafort has obstructed justice. Part of this is just based on what he's been doing for a living for so many years. Just remind us what that is and how his background is potentially relevant to this case.
So Paul Manafort's quite deeply connected to Russian intelligence and Russian oligarchs that are closely tied to Putin. So at least since 2005, he worked for a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska. And in 2005, the Associated Press actually found the memo that Manafort sent to Deripaska, his kind of sales pitch. And in the sales pitch, he said, I can work for you, and this would be great for Putin. And then they actually start to work together, Manafort being paid $10 million a year. And Manafort hires his deputy, and one of his deputies is in fact this individual that is said to have active ties to Russian intelligence, according to the FBI.
And this is all before the 2016 campaign stuff. And so it leads you to write this. Any fair reading of the public record would surely come to the conclusion that there is significant evidence of collusion, or, to put it more precisely, evidence of a conspiracy with Russians in violation of federal campaign finance law. That precise way of putting it seems important because collusion in a strict sense doesn't seem to be against the law. So what is against the law, and why does collusion matter?
Right. So collusion is a kind of a funny term, doesn't have any real legal meaning, and therefore...
And yet we talk about it constantly.
All the time. And therefore it's a goalpost that can be moved forwards and backwards by both sides, because they can say, oh, I see collusion, and they have a low bar, and somebody says, I don't see any, and they're thinking about something almost unimaginable. So under the law, we're really talking about a conspiracy to defraud the United States, and that's what Mueller has already charged the 13 Russian nationals with. And the question is, are there any Americans who aided the Russians in their conspiracy? That's one way of just looking at this plainly. And there's a lot in the public record that leads one to think there's evidence of Paul Manafort having aided the Russians. Not proof of, but just there's some evidence already in the record.
Give me like the two things that are the best case for that.
Two things. One is
or one or three. But
no, two. I can do two. One, Paul Manafort, who knows better because this is his fifth major presidential campaign, is involved in that Trump Tower meeting. So he's on the emails that say the Russian government is offering the Trump campaign dirt on Hillary Clinton. Yeah. And he's at the meeting in which the campaign, through Don Jr., presses the Russian government attorney for the information on Clinton. We also find out that two of those Russian delegates are actually highly suspected to be Russian spies. And they're trying to get information from the Russians to assist the campaign. They also support the idea that the Russians would give them this kind of information. That's a big part of it.
Let me interject right here. Some legal observers say it's not a crime if the Russians did it and they gave them the dirt. It would only be a crime if they asked the Russians to do it and that triggered them taking on this activity. Is that your read on where the line is?
So campaign finance law specifically says if you solicit something of value from a foreign national, and there's clear solicitation of this in the Don Jr. emails.
So it doesn't matter if they already have it?
No, it doesn't matter if they already have it. And Don Jr. is actually saying this is like great later in the summer. And then what's Don Jr. doing on behalf of the campaign in that meeting with the top brass and Manafort? But he admits on Sean Hannity's show that he pressed the Russian government attorney for the information. So they're actually trying to solicit the information from the Russians. That's one part of it. Then there's this other piece where the Washington Post broke the story that they had the email exchanges between Manafort and this guy in Kiev, the Russian operative, this operative linked to Russian intelligence, where Manafort says to him, can we make ourselves whole with the Russian oligarch, and I will offer him private briefings on the campaign. So at this point, and that's after Manafort is told that the Russians have dirt, essentially, on Clinton, that's getting close to the conspiracy. They're forwarding the conspiracy, advancing the conspiracy that the Russians are engaging in by interfering with the election.
So that's the case for conspiracy. I'm still curious, though, if you're Paul Manafort or defending him, if you're mostly worried about that, or if it's the constellation of other possible criminal wrongdoing that this investigation could demonstrate. And I'm thinking of things like campaign finance violations, perhaps money laundering. Which bucket would concern you more?
I think the bucket that would concern me more are all these financial crimes. And those are so easily proven.
So not necessarily the conspiracy or quote-unquote collusion, but this other stuff.
Exactly. And in the sense that that's why I think Mueller's pushing ahead on all the financial crimes. They're so easily proven just by the documentation, and he failed to report certain income and property and all the rest of it. So I think he's really cornered in that sense. And the other part's hard to prove. And the other part's also hard to prove in court, because Mueller has to decide whether or not they would divulge things like intelligence sources and methods in order to prosecute him. There are just so many reasons that that's a much more difficult position for the prosecution and easier for the defense. That's why I would think that what Mueller's doing right now is going for the easier part and trying to press him to give information on the harder part.
So much more to talk about, and I trust we'll have occasion to do it in the weeks and months ahead. Ryan Goodman, thanks so much.
Thank you.